So this one's hot in. We saw the news last night, and well, on the face of it, it's I think kind of good news. I know that John's been dancing a merry jig,
Yes.
um, but basically, there's been developments with The Last of Us Online, which was initially supposed to be a multiplayer variant of The Last of Us Part Two, and I think we all sort of expected a sequel to Factions from The Last of Us, which was absolutely phenomenal, really great multiplayer game. But it looks like Naughty Dog has taken the decision to cease development on this, citing fears that the entire studio could be sucked into some sort of games as a service nightmare. And that's not who they think they are. They think that they're a single player, narrative driven company, and that's what they want to double down on. And so the game has been cancelled. I'm going to obviously come to you on this, John, because you must be pretty happy about this, assuming that this doesn't result in layoffs and stuff like that, the sort of unpleasant side of a project cancellation.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on this? Because on the face of it, it's basically a rejection of the strategy that was put forward by Jim Ryan, which is that we're going to have a set amount of resources put aside to do games as a service because we really believe in it. And well, recent evidence suggests that games as a service is not the right direction, certainly not according to that strategy. So I'm curious about your thoughts on this one.
Oh, I mean, obviously, I do want to start by saying I don't like to see projects get canceled, especially once they've been publicly revealed. I
Yeah.
do feel bad for the developers here, and clearly a lot of people poured a lot of time into making something here, and it could have been an excellent product for sure. So I do feel for them, but I am glad they came to this realization. I think perhaps the big mistake here was going too far with the multiplayer, because I think
Yeah.
many would agree that Naughty Dog's made good multiplayer games.
Yeah.
A lot of people liked Factions. I thought Uncharted actually had like extremely enjoyable, very simple kind of multiplayer. And I feel like the rise of games as a service has kind of made that type of multiplayer game somehow no longer like achievable like it technically should be, but they're just kind of disappearing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Which is a huge shame, I think, because those types of games that don't require a gigantic amount of time investment, I think, are still worthwhile and fun to play, and also don't require perhaps as much support from the development side. I think that what they canceled here, though, The Last of Us Online, was probably born out of similar initiatives that were happening around the industry like 4 years ago. 4 or 5 years ago. I think this is the same thing that Bethesda, before they were part of Xbox, was looking at in the Bethesda ZeniMax management, which resulted in games like Wolfenstein Youngblood, Wolfenstein, sorry, Redfall and the
Fallout
like,
76.
Fallout 76, where they're like, let's take these single player IPs and these developers that are primarily built to make single player games, even though they were very much marketing like the whole company around single player at the time. We're going to have them do these sort of multiplayer live servicey style games. And I just don't think that those studios were exceptionally well built for that. Fallout 76 has turned around, but it was a disaster at first. And I see other people throw out examples like, well, Activision does it. They still had single player, and then they, Call of Duty. And I'm like, do you really want to follow the Call of Duty model when you look at the sheer volume of studios and money required to pull it off? I think it's not good. The only studio I might argue that comes to mind, and somebody else mentioned this, is probably like Respawn, where they've managed to somehow do Apex Legends, which is excellent, while also still continuing to create single player games, which despite the bugs, those games are good and they're very well made. So Respawn has figured it out. But I think with the way Naughty Dog works and like the level that they target for their games, I feel like to support a live service game would have effectively required them to at least like double in size. They would have had to effectively create a second Naughty Dog to really support this at the level I'd imagine they wanted to. And they probably decided that's not the way to go. They don't want to spend that money necessary to fund that team. Maybe the studio's ambitions and just the way it works isn't really compatible with that style of design. Whatever the reason, I think they've probably made the right choice. I just hope that they can find some way to leverage content that's been created so it's not just all thrown away. But yeah, I mean, clearly this became kind of a time and money sink for them too, right? Because
Been a while.
Last of Us 2 2020, obviously pandemic hit, which is not good, but also weirdly relevant to The Last of Us. But then we've just had kind of these remasters, but no hint at what their actual next big single player game might be. So by the time we see it, it could have been, I'm just going to guess, like 8 years after The Last of Us Part 2 before it possibly manifests, which is, it's a really long time.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm happy that they're back in that direction, but man, it's almost become like this black hole for Naughty Dog somehow.
Absolutely. Yeah. Any extra thoughts on that, Alex?
Yeah, I'm just a little confused industry-wise. What's preventing games from not being games as a service, but just having multiplayer components? Like,
Well, that's the question.
yeah, like
right?
The money.
Like,
They want that money.
like for example,
Get
I
that
can
money.
load up. I was originally gonna say like, oh, I can just load up like Half-Life and play some team deathmatch. Like, it's not super complex. But to go into a more recent route, I think they unfortunately do seasons here too. But if you look up like Gears of War, like they have like a multiplayer component that is honestly simple enough. Like it's got some levels, you got some TDM, you got some capture the flag, whatever, some very simple scripted game rules. And people really like those games and they play the multiplayer component of them. And I don't think it's like some sort of like expansive multi-year 1,000-person effort to keep a live service. I don't think it is that. And I don't understand why the industry is obsessed with this. Why, if you want a multiplayer game, you can also do a standalone multiplayer game like you did in the mid 2000s.
I think they just don't make money from it.
I don't understand. How can you not make
Everybody
money
is
from that?
obsessed with monthly active users and engagement.
I mean,
the two most toxic terms.
how on earth
in
did
the
these
industry
games
right
get made
now.
in the 2000s then? Why do they, like, what is the budgeting going
Budgets
on?
were smaller.
Yeah, but they were still
Budgets were
multi-million.
smaller.
You had like Battlefield
But they
was
were
huge. It still cost millions of dollars to make. Like, why not just have that? I don't know if it's too big or like what's going on, but like, did the entire player base move on? Do people not play games that just release and have a few patches?
So
Like, what's going on?
I guess back then the money was made from traditional sales. Like Battlefield 2 comes out on the PC. They sell it at stores. Yeah. Everybody pays their money to own the product.
You buy a game as opposed to downloading it and
right.
and paying for it via microtransactions.
And there's become that shift where, and a lot of these services, I blame them for it, but they essentially have trained people to view these experiences as, oh, you should be able to play this for free, right? And then as you become engaged, you spend money on it. And so I feel like companies think that they cannot release a product like this without essentially either being free or like provide this constant service. And you see people complain all the time about the quote unquote end game and like all this kind of stuff. It's like, there is a subset of people that play these games that are not happy to just play through a game and enjoy that game. They must continue to play that game, which also gets into the other problem of like, how many of these can even coexist, right? There's only a finite amount of times available. People tend to latch on to one or two of these things and they play them for years, right? That's like what they want.
All right.
And it's also like, you think about the younger audiences and stuff, the ones growing up on Minecraft and Roblox, that's all they play. Will they ever transition to these games? Will they just continue to play Roblox for eternity?
Or Fortnite or whatever.
Or Fortnite as well. And I see this in my own house actually, with Roblox. Yeah. So it's an interesting situation that we find ourselves in. But I agree though, Alex, at the principle side of things, it's a shame. And you gave all these other examples, but I think Naughty Dog's own products are a perfect example. Uncharted 4, factions from The Last of Us Part 1. It's exactly the type of multiplayer you're talking about, where it's just like, it's included with the game and it's fun, it's good, it's there. It has support, but it's not the kind of support that live service requires.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a big disappointment because there's a lot of factions fans out there, and it is an exceptional multiplayer experience within its own scope, right? But then looking at the Naughty Dog statement here, They're saying, in ramping up to full production, the massive scope of our ambition became clear. To release and support The Last of Us Online, we'd have had to put all of our studio resources behind supporting post-launch content for years to come, severely impacting development on future single-player games. And I think this is kind of like the point we want to make, which is that, well, why do you need to make this post-launch content? And I guess it's this kind of arms race that's happened in the games as a service sort of arena, where you've got to have seasons, you've got to have battle passes, and
more content, quote unquote.
Yeah, it's just we've kind of reached bizarre situation where Nicki Minaj is cropping up in Call of Duty Warzone.
Yeah, there's no consistency.
In the quest for more content to be added.
I think it all comes back to this high risk, high reward, right? If a game as a service does very well, you stand to make a ton of money. Companies want that. The problem is when it goes horribly wrong, not only does it impact the game itself, but it impacts the future of the studio and like basically puts a black mark for like a decade. Like look at what happened with Crystal Dynamics and the Avengers. Right? Like it's basically like a decade without, not all, it's getting there. It's going to be close to a decade between like when they stopped doing Tomb Raider and then they put all their eggs in this Avengers, and it kind of came and went and failed and it's dead.
When did they release the new Rise?
Right. I think it was that 2014.
Yeah.
I feel like that was 2014.
Maybe, yeah.
Wow. I was still living in France when I covered that, I think. Well, wait, maybe that was 2015.
I can't remember also.
I don't know.
It's been a while.
It's between 8 to 10 years since they finished that, I would say. And then the Avengers, you look at something like the Avengers versus like, let's say you have a big single player game that comes out, like Alan Wake 2, for instance. If we look at those sales and, maybe they start off a little bit rough, or Control was like this as well. But given the type of game it is, it can continue to gain sales over time and hopefully become like a long-term success, have a long tail. These live service games, if they don't make it big right away and the word of mouth is bad, it can kill them forever. And then long term, the game just disappears. It's dead. It's shut down. You can't play it anymore. And all that work is just lost to time.
Awful.
And it's like, it just feels like a waste of everyone's time at that point. Mm-hmm. And yes, I know there's value in the experiences you had along the way, whatever.
The Freds, it's all about
I am dismissive of that, but I understand why people find that important as well. But still, I just find that a shame. And it feels like if it works, again, huge success. But if it doesn't, it's like a black hole for the company.
I guess my question is this, right? Let's look at the statement again. In ramping up to full production, the massive scope of our ambition became clear. And they're talking about they have to become basically a games as a service studio. How did they just reach that realization now? Right? Because
I think that's that's PR.
Right. Okay. Because obviously, we've all seen the horror stories like Avengers, and we know that, the scale and the ambition of these kinds of games in order to make an impact, would have been pretty much sort of understandable from the get-go. So it must have been just like either the studio basically decided, right, this isn't what we do, or they weren't happy with the software, or they just didn't want to take the gamble. It was maybe a do or die moment, the sort of sunk cost fallacy moment.
Yep.
Is it worth it? I don't know. It's just really interesting that the time is now that they decided to put an end to it and return to the single player games as a focus. Because I'll tell you what, I mean, this is actually a big moment, because if Naughty Dog, with all of its quality, is saying we can't do this, then that's big, right? Because if they can't, who can?
Well, a studio that's willing to staff up specifically to make this type of game.
The thing is, though, you were talking about games as a service, as a gamble, and Naughty Dog is the closest you're going to get to a sure bet, right? In terms of quality of the software. So this, I consider that to be quite a 180.
I agree. I think they could have done it in the end if they really wanted to, but I suspect again it's this realization that they would have to dedicate so many resources and hire up so much to keep this running. And I suspect the people working on their traditional single player games don't want to do this. And I think we even see this within companies like Bungie that bet the farm on games as a service. It was a huge reward initially. They arguably created this craze with Destiny, right?
Yeah.
They're not doing so good right now. And I feel like the big mistake Bungie made was not also finding a way to support their more traditional types of games as well. And, you know, hearing all the stories coming out of that from different people and just the state of things, it doesn't sound great over there anymore.
Well, it raises questions about Marathon, which is their next big games as a service offering, right?
Imagine if they had decided to launch that as like a return to form as a single player thing, while also building out Destiny, split the teams, you know, offer something to Bungie fans of both the Destiny service style game, which I liked Destiny for sure, but then also something different. And they're just so focused on this as opposed to, you know, what they've done with Destiny. Like Bungie as it is now is nothing like it used to be.
John, what do you think of the Marathon?
Makes me sad.
Do you think of games as a service?
Nope.
Me too. So I'm really confused.
It's such a man. I know. That's
it's like that is not what Marathon is.
The original game was a dead boxed game.
Okay.
I would say.
I don't know. I think the thing that's concerning me is basically the death of the multiplayer mode as it used to be.
Yeah,
because,
that is concerning.
You know, there were some great, and I count Factions as one of them. There were some great multiplayer games that came out, but maybe the calculus was simply, well, we can put The Last of Us Part 2 out without a multiplayer segment, and, you know, it still makes massive amounts of money. So why make a multiplayer game, a multiplayer mode, which I think is a bit of a shame, right?
You could also just, like I was just, multiplayer mode, that's obviously taken away from resources. That was a big issue at one point in time. That's why you got things like Dead Space 3 multiplayer, etc. It was a big issue. But what's wrong with a smaller scale multiplayer title that is a bit cheaper and also has lower production value?
I mean, again, I can imagine, like, internally, I don't know what the finances look like, but even those types of games, there is a certain level of back-end support needed. People need to be paid to a certain degree. How long can you keep that running? Does it make enough money to actually support that?
Right.
Like, maybe, what if they combine some aspects of both and they have that traditional older style multiplayer, but they also sell hats, right?
Right.
Team
Generate
Fortress
some
did
revenue.
That, you know,
that stuff's relatively harmless, I would say, and people do like it. You know, just put some fun stuff in there, but don't go the full live game like seasons route.
That would be interesting.
I'm just sort of fascinated by the concept of this post-apocalyptic world where hats are the new currency.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it. And season 3.
Yeah.
It's like the seasons are basically just seasons.
Yeah.
You know, summer, winter.
It is interesting,
spring.
though, how like.
Oh, Rich, oh man, that's actually good. Somebody should put that in a product. It's like.
I mean, at least on PC, these things still do exist, though. There are pure multiplayer games that are occupying the upper indie to AA space that do not have seasons. But it's interesting that it seems to not be there on consoles.
Also, like remasters of some game, like some of the stuff Night Dive's done, they've put multiplayer in those games, and it freaking rules.
Yeah, right.
You can just play the old school multiplayer, and it's just what you'd want, and it runs on modern hardware. I love that.
Absolutely.
That's actually the type of multiplayer. I always say, I'm not a multiplayer guy, but I love that type of multiplayer. And that's what I miss. I just don't like multiplayer that's so focused on progression.
Right.
That's what really lost me, because it just demands too much time from you. It doesn't allow me to play the way I'd like to play it. And there's enough of that stuff already out there that I feel like people should be satisfied. Why not? Why can't we have both?
Well, you know,
games as well.
You know, Nicki Minaj in a post-apocalyptic world. It's the future of multiplayer.
Get tactical with Nicki Minaj.
Get tactical with Nicki Minaj.